There is an unspoken rule on the brutal winter streets of Chicago. Keep your head down and never interfere in business that isn't yours. Madeline Foster broke both rules the night she found a little girl shivering in a dark, snow-choked alley. She didn't know the child was the heir to the Castellano crime syndicate, stolen during a botched ransom grab. She only knew the girl was freezing to death. Slipping her only winter coat over the child's trembling shoulders, Madeline walked into the sub-zero night, believing she had simply saved a life. She had no idea she had just signed a blood pact with the city's most dangerous man. The wind howling off Lake Michigan didn't just chill you, it hunted you. It was mid-January, and the temperature had plummeted to a staggering -12 degrees. For Madeline Foster, the cold was a physical adversary she fought every single day. Madeline pushed open the heavy glass door of O'Rourke's Diner on 4th Street, the bell above it giving a pathetic, muffled jingle. Her shift had ended 3 hours ago, but her manager, a gruff man named Pete, had demanded she cover the dish pit when the night guy didn't show. She didn't have the luxury of saying no. Every dollar was a brick in the wall she was building between herself and her past, a past named Richard, whose heavy footsteps and cruel hands she still saw in her nightmares. Stepping out onto the icy pavement, Madeline pulled her coat tighter around her slender frame. It was a heavy, emerald green wool trench coat. It was vintage, frayed at the cuffs, and missing its top wooden button, but it was the most valuable thing she owned. She had bought it at a thrift store in Pilsen for $12. Without it, the Chicago winter would have consumed her weeks ago. The streets were entirely deserted. The city had issued a severe weather advisory, urging everyone to stay indoors. Streetlights flickered above, casting sickly yellow pools onto the mounting snowdrifts. Madeline kept her chin tucked into her collar, her boots crunching rhythmically, her mind focused only on the radiator in her tiny, drafty apartment on Darman Avenue. She was passing the narrow, shadowy mouth of an alley near the abandoned textile factory on 43rd when she heard it. It wasn't a cry. It was a whimper. A soft, breathless sound that was barely audible over the roaring wind. Madeline froze. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to keep walking. Keep your head down. Don't engage. This was the South Side. Alleys at 2 a.m. were where bad things happened to good people. But the whimper came again, followed by a violent, rattling cough. Madeline swallowed hard, her breath pluming in the icy air. She stepped into the alley. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. Near the back by a rusted dumpster, a small shape was huddled in the snow. Madeline hurried forward, dropping to her knees, heedless of the freezing slush seeping through her jeans. It was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 6. The child was dressed in what looked like a shredded, high-end school uniform. A plaid skirt and a white blouse, now stained with dirt and soot. She was missing a shoe, her tiny foot blue and raw against the ice. Her dark hair was matted, and her lips were a terrifying shade of violet. "Oh my God, sweetheart," Madeline gasped, reaching out. The girl flinched violently, pressing herself against the brick wall, her wide, terrified eyes locking onto Madeline. She was in severe shock. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you," Madeline said softly, keeping her hands visible. "Where are your parents? How did you get out here?" The girl's teeth chattered so hard she couldn't form words. She just shook her head, tears freezing to her pale cheeks the second they fell. Madeline didn't need to be a doctor to know the child was minutes away from hypothermia taking her completely. She looked around the desolate alley. There was no one. No cars, no police sirens. Just the deadly, suffocating cold. Without a second thought, Madeline stood up and unbuttoned the emerald green coat. The moment she slipped it off her shoulders, the sub-zero wind slammed into her, biting through her thin waitress uniform sweater like thousands of icy needles. She suppressed a gasp, immediately dropping to her knees again and wrapping the heavy wool tightly around the little girl. The coat swallowed the child whole, pooling around her in the snow. Madeline rolled up the sleeves and buttoned it up to the girl's chin. "There," Madeline whispered, her own teeth beginning to chatter uncontrollably. "Better?" The girl looked up at Madeline, her small hands clutching the lapels of the green coat. You're freezing," the child managed to whisper. "I run hot," Madeline lied, forcing a smile though her lips were already turning blue. "Come on, we need to get you inside." Madeline scooped the child into her arms. The girl was startlingly light, but the snow made the trek treacherous. Madeline knew the nearest hospital was St. Michael's, about 4 blocks away. Under normal circumstances, it was a 10-minute walk. Tonight, it felt like an Arctic expedition. Every step was agony. The cold seized Madeline's lungs, making every breath feel like inhaling crushed glass. Her arms went numb, then her legs. She kept murmuring softly to the girl, telling her stories, promising her warmth, anything to keep the child awake. By the time the glowing red emergency sign of St. Michael's cut through the blizzard, Madeline was operating purely on adrenaline and fading willpower. She pushed through the sliding double doors, stumbling into the blindingly bright, sterile waiting room. "Help!" Madeline rasped, her voice cracking. "She needs help!" 2 nurses and an orderly rushed forward. They took the girl from Madeline's frozen arms, immediately shouting out vitals and calling for blankets. "What happened? Who is she?" One of the nurses, a woman with a name tag that read Sarah, demanded, looking at Madeline. "I don't know. I found her in an alley," Madeline choked out, leaning heavily against the reception desk. Her vision was blurring. "We need your name, ma'am. The police are going to want to speak with you," the nurse said, already dialing a phone. The word police acted like a bucket of ice water over Madeline's already frozen state. If the police ran her name, they would find her old address. They might contact Richard. Or worse, Richard had friends in the local precinct who owed him favors. She had spent a year becoming a ghost. She couldn't risk being dragged back into the light. I'll be right back. I need to use the restroom," Madeline stammered. Before the nurse could stop her, Madeline turned and bolted. She pushed back out into the deadly night, leaving her emerald coat and her only protection against the winter behind. Vincent Castellano did not beg. He did not plead. He was a man who moved mountains with a whisper and ended lives with a nod. As the head of the Castellano syndicate, which controlled the ports, the unions, and the underground casinos from the south side to the Gold Coast, he was untouchable. But as he stood in the center of his sprawling, fortified estate in Oak Brook, staring at the shattered glass of his daughter's favorite snow globe on the floor, Vincent was entirely powerless. "Say it again," Vincent commanded, his voice deadly quiet. His second-in-command, Leo, stood nervously by the mahogany desk. Leo was a hardened enforcer, a man who had survived gang wars and federal indictments, but right now he couldn't meet his boss's eyes. "The transport was hit on Route 83, boss," Leo said, his voice tight. "The Albanians, Dushku's crew. They rammed the SUV with a snowplow. They took out Paulie and the driver. When our backup arrived, the Albanians were dead, but Lily was gone. The storm was a whiteout. We think she crawled out of the wreckage and ran into the city." Vincent's chest tightened, a cold, suffocating panic wrapping around his heart. His 6-year-old daughter. Out there, in negative 12 degrees, with rival hitmen scouring the streets for her to use as leverage. "You have every man on the payroll on the street," Vincent said, his tone devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the absolute rage boiling in his veins. If you don't find her, Leo, don't bother coming back." For 3 agonizing hours, the Castellano Empire turned Chicago upside down. Bribes were paid, threats were issued, and doors were kicked in. The Albanians who survived the crash were found and interrogated with brutal, terrifying efficiency. They admitted to the hit, but swore the girl had vanished in the blizzard. Then, the burner phone in Vincent's pocket vibrated. "Boss?" Leo's voice cracked over the line. "St. Michael's Hospital. We found her. She's alive." 10 minutes later, a fleet of black, armored SUVs skidded to a halt outside the emergency room. Vincent bypassed security, ignoring the shouting guards, his men forming a silent, intimidating wall behind him. He threw open the door to room 3B. Lily was sitting up in the hospital bed, holding a cup of hot cocoa. She looked impossibly small, hooked up to a warming IV, her face pale, but breathing steadily. "Lily," Vincent choked, the ruthless mob boss shattering instantly as he dropped to his knees by the bed, pulling her into his chest. "My God! Principessa, are you hurt?" "I'm okay, Papa," Lily whispered, burying her face in his expensive tailored suit. "It was cold. The bad men crashed our car. I ran away." Vincent pulled back, cupping her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "I know, baby. The bad men are gone. They will never, ever hurt you again." He kissed her forehead, a silent vow of absolute destruction directed at the Dushku family. He stood up, looking at the doctor who was nervously hovering in the corner. "Who brought her in? Was it one of my men?" "No, Mr. Castellano," the doctor stammered, clearly aware of who he was speaking to. "It was a young woman. She didn't leave a name. She just dropped the girl off and ran. The police are looking into it." "Cancel the police. My men will handle it," Vincent snapped. He turned back to Lily. "A woman brought you here, Lily. Who was she?" Lily pointed to the chair in the corner of the room. Draped over the cheap plastic was a heavy, emerald-green wool coat. It was soaked through with melted snow. "The angel," Lily said softly. "She found me in the dark. She was shivering, Papa. But she took off her armor and gave it to me." Vincent stared at the coat. In his world, there were no good Samaritans. Every action had an angle. Was this woman a scout for the Albanians who got cold feet? Was she trying to set up a ransom of her own? "Leo," Vincent barked. Leo stepped into the room. "Yeah, boss?" "Bag that coat. Have the boys tear it apart. Find out who it belongs to." Vincent's eyes narrowed, staring at the frayed fabric. Nobody just walks away in a blizzard without a coat. She's hiding from something. Find her. By dawn, the Castellano machine had processed the evidence. They sat in the back room of a front business, a high-end Italian bakery in the West Loop. The green coat lay on the stainless steel prep table like a crime scene exhibit. "We checked the hospital cameras," Leo reported, sliding an iPad across the table to Vincent. The grainy footage showed a young woman, her hair plastered to her face with snow, carrying Lily into the ER. She was wearing only a thin, cheap diner uniform. She looked exhausted, terrified, and violently shivering. "We couldn't get facial recognition. She kept her head down," Leo continued. "But we searched the coat, found 2 things. First, a dry cleaning tag hidden in the lining. Miller's Cleaners in Pilsen. We woke the owner up. He keeps meticulous paper records. The coat belongs to a Madeline Foster." Vincent stared at the name. "Who is she? Connected to Dushku?" "No," Leo said, shaking his head. "Complete ghost. But we found something else in the pocket." He used a pair of tweezers to drop a crumpled, damp piece of paper onto the table. A grocery receipt from a bodega on 18th Street. Dated yesterday. Vincent leaned over and read the faded ink. 1 can of generic chicken soup, 1 loaf of day-old bread. Total, $3.45. Paid in cash. Vincent frowned, his sharp mind processing the discrepancy. She's broke. She's buying day-old bread, yet she gave up a heavy winter coat in the middle of a killer storm to a child she didn't know? Looks that way, boss. Vincent touched the wool of the green coat, the missing wooden button, the frayed cuffs. It was the armor of a woman fighting a war of poverty, and she had surrendered it for his daughter. In Vincent's ruthless universe, debts were paid in blood or cash. This woman had just handed him his world, and in return, she had walked out to face the ice, alone. "Find her address," Vincent said quietly. Now. The cold had settled into Madeline's bones, and it refused to leave. It had been 3 days since she left the little girl at the hospital. Her desperate run back to her apartment had nearly killed her. By the time she had unlocked her door on Darman Avenue, her lips were bleeding, and she couldn't feel her hands or feet. Now, she lay huddled under 2 thin, moth-eaten blankets on her sagging mattress, shivering so violently her teeth ached. The radiator in the corner was hissing, but it provided no real heat, merely mocking her with its noise. Her chest burned with every breath, a deep, rattling cough that tasted like rust. Pneumonia. She knew the symptoms, but a doctor cost money she didn't have, and a hospital would ask questions she couldn't answer. Her phone, sitting on the milk crate beside the bed, buzzed. She reached a trembling, pale hand out and tapped the screen. It was a text from Pete at the diner. "You missed 3 shifts, Maddie. I need reliability. Don't bother coming back. I'll mail your final check." Madeline dropped the phone, a dry sob escaping her throat. She was fired. She had exactly $18 to her name, half a box of stale crackers in the cupboard, and her lungs were failing her. The universe had a cruel sense of humor. She had tried to do one good thing, and it was going to cost her everything. She closed her eyes, letting the feverish haze pull her under. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe going to sleep and not waking up was better than constantly looking over her shoulder for Richard. Thud. Madeline's eyes snapped open, her heart hammered against her ribs. Thud. Thud. Heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs outside her apartment. The steps were deliberate, heavy. Not the erratic shuffle of her neighbor, Mrs. Gable. These were the boots of men who owned the ground they walked on. Richard. The thought struck her like a physical blow. He had found her. The police at the hospital must have run her face or recognized her from a missing persons report. He had tracked her down. Panic overrode the fever. Madeline threw off the blankets, her legs buckling instantly as they hit the freezing floorboards. She caught herself on the wall, gasping for air, and stumbled toward the tiny kitchenette. She pulled open the top drawer and grabbed a rusty paring knife, her only defense. She backed into the corner of the living room, her hands shaking violently, aiming the small blade at the door. Bang! The front door didn't just open. The deadbolt was violently splintered from the frame. The door swung open, hitting the wall with a deafening crash. Madeline let out a choked scream. 2 massive men in dark winter coats stepped into the room. They looked around with clinical efficiency, ignoring her completely for a fraction of a second to ensure the room was clear. One of them, a man with a scarred jaw, Leo, locked eyes with her. He didn't look like Richard. He looked infinitely more dangerous. "Clear," Leo said over his shoulder. A third man stepped through the shattered doorway. Vincent Castellano commanded the room the second he entered. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal wool overcoat and leather gloves, looking entirely out of place in her grimy, peeling apartment. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his sharp, aristocratic features were set in a mask of absolute coldness. His dark eyes scanned the room, taking in the water stains on the ceiling, the empty cupboards, and finally, settling on Madeline. He saw the pathetic paring knife trembling in her hands. He saw the sweat on her pale forehead, the hollows of her cheeks, and the violent tremors racking her body. "Madeline Foster," Vincent said. His voice was a rich, smooth baritone, but it carried the weight of an executioner's axe. Who are you?" Madeline managed to wheeze, her chest burning. "If Richard sent you, tell him I have nothing. I have nothing left." Vincent slowly pulled off his leather gloves, slipping them into his pocket. He didn't step closer, giving her space, like one might a cornered, wounded animal. "I don't know who Richard is," Vincent said quietly. "But if he is the reason you live in this squalor, I will have my men find him and correct the issue." Madeline blinked, the fever making the room spin. "What?" Vincent gestured to Leo. Leo stepped forward and placed a large, heavy shopping bag onto her rickety kitchen table. He reached inside and pulled out a cascade of emerald green wool. Madeline gasped, her grip on the knife loosening slightly. "My coat." "You left it at St. Michael's," Vincent said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Wrapped around my daughter." The realization hit Madeline like a freight train. The expensive clothes the girl was wearing, the immediate arrival of dangerous-looking men. She hadn't just saved a rich kid. She had intercepted the business of the Mafia. I didn't know," Madeline stammered, dropping the knife. It clattered loudly against the linoleum. She backed against the wall, sliding down until she hit the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. "I swear, I didn't see anyone. I just found her in the alley. She was freezing. Please, I didn't see anything. Don't kill me." Vincent's expression shifted. The hard, untouchable Mafia Don fractured for a split second, replaced by genuine bewilderment. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw a woman who was deathly ill, terrified out of her mind, expecting a bullet for an act of pure mercy. He stepped forward, unbuttoning his own expensive charcoal overcoat. He shrugged it off and walked slowly toward her. Madeline flinched, turning her face away and bracing for a strike. Instead, warmth enveloped her. Vincent knelt before her, entirely disregarding the dirt on the floor, and draped his heavy, body-heat-warmed overcoat around her shaking shoulders. It smelled of expensive cologne and clean winter air. "Kill you," Vincent whispered, his voice incredibly gentle, yet vibrating with an intense, terrifying promise. "Madeline, in my world, people would sell their own mothers for a fraction of what you gave up. You gave your only defense against the winter to a child you did not know." He reached out, his warm, large hand gently touching her blazing, feverish forehead. He frowned deeply. "You're burning up," he noted grimly. He stood up, turning to Leo. "Call Dr. Harrison. Tell him to prep the private suite at the estate, and get the car heated." "Wait!" Madeline rasped, trying to push the heavy coat off, but she was too weak. "What are you doing? I can't go anywhere. I can't pay for—" "You misunderstand the situation, Miss Foster," Vincent said, leaning down and effortlessly scooping her up into his arms. He held her against his chest, as if she weighed no more than Lily did. "You owe me nothing. I, however, owe you a life. And a Castellano always pays his debts." Madeline swam through a thick, heavy fog, her body burning and freezing in violent, alternating waves. The scent of stale rot and freezing plaster from her Darman Avenue apartment was gone, replaced by the crisp, sterile scent of eucalyptus and expensive lavender detergent. She opened her eyes, gasping as a sharp pain flared in her chest. "Easy. Don't try to sit up yet," a calm, authoritative voice instructed. Madeline blinked against the soft, warm light of a bedside lamp. She was lying in a bed the size of a small room, swallowed by a mountain of heavy goose-down comforters and Egyptian cotton sheets. The walls were panelled in rich, dark mahogany, and heavy velvet drapes blocked out the winter sun. Sitting in a leather armchair beside the bed was an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a neatly trimmed grey beard. He was packing a stethoscope into a worn leather medical bag. Where am I?" Madeline rasped, her throat feeling like sandpaper. "You're in Oak Brook, at the Castellano estate," the man said, pouring a glass of water from a silver pitcher and holding it to her lips. "Drink slowly. I'm Dr. Arthur Harrison. Until 3 years ago, I was the chief of pulmonology at Northwestern Memorial, so you are in capable hands, Miss Foster. You have a severe case of bilateral pneumonia. You've been unconscious for nearly 48 hours. Madeline choked on the water, panic instantly flooding her system. 48 hours. "I have to go," she wheezed, weakly pushing the covers aside. "I can't be here. He'll find me. Richard will check the hospitals." "You aren't in a hospital," Dr. Harrison said gently, pressing a firm hand against her shoulder to keep her down. "And I assure you, no one is finding you here unless Vincent allows it. Now breathe. The antibiotics need time to work." Before Madeline could protest further, the heavy oak door of the bedroom clicked open. Vincent Castellano stepped inside. He had traded his charcoal overcoat for a tailored navy blue suit, no tie, the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt undone. He looked less like a home invader and more like a ruthless CEO, but the predatory grace in his steps remained. "How is she, Arthur?" Vincent asked, his dark eyes locking onto Madeline. "Fever is breaking, but her lungs are severely compromised," Dr. Harrison replied, snapping his bag shut. "She needs absolute bed rest, a high-calorie diet, and the continuous IV drip for another 2 days. I'll be back this evening." Vincent nodded, dismissing the doctor without a word. Once the heavy door clicked shut, the silence in the massive room became suffocating. Madeline pulled the silk sheet up to her chin, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "You kept your word," Vincent said quietly, walking over to the window and pulling the velvet drape back just an inch to look out at the snow-covered grounds. "My men checked your apartment. You packed nothing. You were preparing to die in that freezing room rather than risk exposing yourself by going to a hospital." "I told you, I didn't know who she was," Madeline said, her voice shaking. "I don't want any money. I don't want any trouble. Just let me leave." Vincent turned to face her. "Leave? And go where?" "Back to an apartment with no door, no heat, and a man named Richard hunting you." Madeline flinched at the name. "That is none of your business." "When you saved Lily's life, your business became mine," Vincent stated, pulling a chair closer to the bed and sitting down. "Let me explain the reality of your situation, Miss Foster. The men who took my daughter are a faction of the Albanian syndicate run by a man named Dushku. They are animals. They lost their leverage when Lily escaped into the storm." Vincent leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze piercing. They know their hit failed because someone intervened. They are actively scouring the south side for a woman in a green coat. If I let you walk out of these gates, Dushku's men will find you before the pneumonia kills you, and they will not be as gentle as I am." Madeline stared at him, the horrifying reality settling like lead in her stomach. She hadn't just crossed paths with the mob, she had put a target on her own back by saving the princess of a criminal empire. I can't stay here," Madeline whispered, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "You don't understand. If I stay in one place, Richard will find me. He always finds me. Vincent's jaw tightened, a dangerous shadow crossing his features. Who is Richard? My ex-husband, Madeline choked out, the shame and terror she had buried for a year bubbling to the surface. Richard Gallagher. He's connected. He plays golf with the alderman. He donates to the police union. When I tried to leave the first time, the cops brought me right back to him. I had to disappear to survive. If he finds out I'm alive, if he finds out where I am, if Richard Gallagher comes within 10 miles of this estate, Vincent interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm, I will have Leo bury him under the foundation of a new high-rise in the Loop. You are under my protection now, Madeline. The ghosts of your past do not cross my threshold. Just then, the door creaked open again. A small head poked through the gap. Papa? Lily asked softly. Vincent's hard expression instantly melted. Come in, Principessa. Lily, dressed in pink fleece pajamas, padded softly across the Persian rug. She held a small, slightly squished stuffed rabbit. She stopped at the edge of the bed, her large brown eyes peering over the mattress at Madeline. Hi, Lily whispered. You're awake. Madeline offered a weak, trembling smile. Hi, Lily. Are you feeling better? Lily nodded. She reached out on her tiptoes and placed the stuffed rabbit on Madeline's pillow. This is Barnaby. He keeps the nightmares away. You can borrow him until your chest stops hurting. A sob caught in Madeline's throat. She reached out with a trembling hand and gently touched Lily's soft hair. Thank you, sweetheart. Vincent watched the exchange in silence. The cold, calculating machinery of his mind was usually reserved for moving shipments through the ports or orchestrating the downfall of his enemies. But looking at the fragile, terrified woman in his guest bed, who had sacrificed her only warmth for his child, Vincent felt something deeply unfamiliar taking root in his chest. A fierce, possessive need to shield her from the world. 4 days passed. The fever broke, but Madeline remained a prisoner of her own recovering body and the high-security walls of the Castellano estate. The opulence of her surroundings was jarring. She was served bone broth and roasted chicken on imported bone china by silent, respectful staff. She wore silk pajamas provided by Vincent's housekeeper, Maria, a stern but motherly woman who tutted over Madeline's bruised ribs and malnourished frame. Yet, despite the luxury, Madeline felt the walls closing in. She spent her days pacing the length of her bedroom, staring out the reinforced glass windows at the armed guards patrolling the snowy perimeter. Vincent visited every evening. He never stayed long, always maintaining a respectful distance, but his presence was a heavy gravity in the room. He brought books from his library, classics, history, poetry. He noticed she had been reading a dog-eared copy of Keats in her apartment, a detail that both touched and unsettled her. He saw too much. Meanwhile, in the belly of Chicago, the gears of the underworld and the corrupt establishment were grinding against each other. At a dimly lit booth in the back of Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse on Rush Street, Richard Gallagher aggressively cut into a rare ribeye. Richard was a handsome man in his early 40s, with the polished, aggressive charm of a high-end real estate developer who routinely bribed zoning commissioners. Sitting across from him was Detective Stan Kowalski of the 21st District, a man whose gambling debts far exceeded his police salary. "I'm paying you 10 grand a month, Stan," Richard sneered, taking a sip of his scotch. "And you're telling me a woman with her description shows up at St. Michael's ER, drops off a kid, and just vanishes into thin air? My wife is dead broke. She doesn't vanish. She hides in the dirt." Kowalski wiped sweat from his balding forehead. "Look, Richard, the ER cameras were a bust. But I pulled the admission logs. The kid she dropped off. It wasn't just any kid. The rumors on the street say it was Vincent Castellano's daughter. Richard stopped chewing. He slowly lowered his fork. The mob boss? Yeah, Kowalski whispered, glancing around nervously. The Albanians hit Castellano's transport. The kid got away, and your wife found her. Word is, Castellano's crew scoured the city that night. If Maddie was the one who brought the kid in, Castellano might have found her. A dark, venomous anger curled in Richard's gut. Madeline was his property. She belonged to him. The thought of another man, even a man as terrifying as Vincent Castellano, having her, made his blood boil. Find out if Castellano has her, Richard commanded, his voice tight with suppressed rage. Are you insane? Kowalski hissed. You don't poke the Castellano family. They run the ports, the unions. They drop bodies in the river for looking at them wrong. I don't care who he is, Richard snapped, leaning over the table. I have the deed to the South Loop development project that his front companies are trying to bid on. I have leverage. Find out where she is, Stan, or I'll cut you off and let your bookies break your legs. Back at the Oak Brook estate, Madeline was sitting by the roaring fireplace in the master library. It was her first day allowed out of the bedroom. She was wrapped in a cashmere shawl, reading one of the books Vincent had brought her. The heavy oak doors opened, and Leo walked in. The scarred enforcer moved with a quiet lethality, holding a garment bag. Boss wanted you to have this back, Miss Foster, Leo said gruffly, hanging the bag on a nearby coat rack and unzipping it. Madeline looked up and gasped. It was her emerald green wool coat, but it was transformed. The frayed cuffs had been expertly tailored and repaired. The missing wooden button was replaced, and the heavy fabric had been deep cleaned and treated, restoring its vibrant color. It looked brand new. He had a tailor in the Gold Coast fix it up, Leo explained, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. Said a piece of armor shouldn't be left broken. Madeline stood up, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch the soft wool. It was a beautiful gesture, yet it triggered a sudden, overwhelming wave of panic. She remembered the night she bought that coat. She had just fled Richard's house with a bruised jaw and a fractured rib. The coat was the first thing she bought with her own money. It was a symbol of her miserable, terrifying independence. Seeing it fixed by another powerful man felt like a leash being slipped around her neck. Take it away, Madeline said sharply, pulling her hand back as if burned. Leo frowned. Miss, I think you misunderstand. I don't misunderstand anything, Madeline snapped, her voice rising, the fear making her reckless. I am not a charity case, and I am not a pet. I don't want his clothes, I don't want his food, and I don't want to be locked in this house anymore. Madeline, Vincent's voice cut through the room like a whip. He stood in the doorway, his dark eyes unreadable. He gestured for Leo to leave. The enforcer nodded and quickly exited, closing the doors behind him. Vincent walked slowly into the room, stopping a few feet from her. You are angry. I am trapped, Madeline yelled, tears of frustration blurring her vision. You fixed my coat. You fixed my lungs. What's next? Do you put a tracker in my arm? Richard gave me beautiful things too. He bought me silk dresses and diamond earrings, right before he locked the deadbolt so I couldn't leave the house. How is this any different? Vincent absorbed the blow without flinching. He looked at the repaired green coat, then back at her. The raw terror in her eyes struck a chord deep within him. He was a man who commanded absolute obedience through fear, but her fear of him tasted like ash in his mouth. It is different, Vincent said softly, his voice devoid of its usual authority, because the door is unlocked. Madeline froze. What? Vincent reached into his inner suit pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. He tossed it onto the coffee table between them. "Inside is $50,000 in untraceable cash," Vincent stated. "There is also a passport with a new name and keys to a car currently parked outside the gates. If you wish to leave, Madeline, you may walk out the front door right now. I will not stop you. I will not follow you." Madeline stared at the envelope, her heart pounding. "But understand this," Vincent continued, stepping closer, his presence commanding but not suffocating. "Dushku is still looking for you, and my men intercepted a communication this morning. Richard Gallagher is using a corrupt detective to track you. He knows you were at the hospital." Madeline gasped, stepping back, her hands instinctively wrapping around her stomach. "He knows." "If you walk out that door," Vincent said, his eyes intensely focused on hers, "you are on your own. You will have to run, and keep running, for the rest of your life. But if you stay of your own free will. And I swear on my daughter's life, no man, not Dushku, and certainly not Richard Gallagher, will ever lay a hand on you again." Madeline looked at the envelope. Freedom, terrifying and dangerous, was right there. She looked back at Vincent, the Mafia boss, the killer, the father who had dropped to his knees in a hospital room. She didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, her legs finally gave out, and she sank into the leather armchair, burying her face in her hands. Vincent didn't touch her. He simply sat in the chair opposite her, a silent, immovable guardian, waiting for her to make her choice. The envelope of cash remained untouched on the mahogany coffee table for 3 weeks. Madeline didn't leave. The choice to stay was the first truly autonomous decision she had made since marrying Richard Gallagher 5 years ago. As the brutal Chicago winter raged on outside the estate's reinforced walls, a tentative, quiet warmth blossomed within them. Madeline's lungs healed under Dr. Harrison's care, and her hollowed cheeks regained their color. She spent her afternoons reading to Lily in the sunroom, the little girl clinging to her with a fierce, unspoken attachment. Vincent was a shadow, always present, always watching, but never crowding her. He was a man who orchestrated violence on a citywide scale, yet when he stepped into the estate, he left the blood at the door. He spoke to Madeline with a quiet reverence that unsettled her as much as it healed her. But outside those walls, a storm of a different kind was brewing. Richard Gallagher was a man driven by toxic pride, and losing Madeline had become an obsession that gnawed at his sanity. When Detective Stan Kowalski finally brought him the confirmation Madeline was inside the Castellano compound, Richard realized his money and minor political influence meant nothing against a fortified Mafia empire. So, he made a desperate, catastrophic pivot. On a freezing Tuesday night, Richard walked into the back room of a smoke-filled social club in Albany Park. Sitting at a felt-lined card table was Agim Dushku, the ruthless head of the Albanian syndicate, who had ordered the botched hit on Vincent's daughter. "You have a lot of nerve walking in here, Gallagher," Agim rumbled, his thick accent lacing the threat with gravel. "You play with city permits, we play with bullets." "I have something you want," Richard said, dropping a heavy, leather-bound folder onto the table. His hands were shaking, but his eyes were manic. "I am the lead developer for the South Loop waterfront project. Castellano has been using his union leverage to block my permits so he can buy the land out from under me. I have the security blueprints for every single one of his smuggling warehouses on the river. I know the shift changes. I know the blind spots." Agim slowly opened the folder, his dark eyes scanning the highly classified architectural schematics. "And what does the rich developer want for the keys to the Castellano kingdom?" "Castellano has my wife," Richard hissed, his face twisting into a mask of pure entitlement. "I want her back, and I want him dead." Agim smiled, a cold, terrifying baring of teeth. "We have a mutual problem, Mr. Gallagher. Let us solve it together." The trap was set 4 days later. Madeline had expressed a quiet desire to attend Sunday Mass. The isolation of the estate was beginning to wear on her, and Vincent, seeing the restless anxiety returning to her eyes, agreed. He arranged for a private viewing balcony at Holy Name Cathedral in the Gold Coast. "Leo will be with you every second," Vincent told her that morning in the foyer, his dark eyes searching hers. "Maria will take Lily to the children's chapel. If you feel even slightly uncomfortable, you give the word. And Leo pulls you out. Understood?" Madeline nodded, pulling the newly repaired emerald green coat over her shoulders. The heavy wool felt like a shield. "I understand, Vincent. Thank you." What Castellano's vast intelligence network didn't know was that Detective Kowalski had abused his badge to place a police-grade GPS tracker on the undercarriage of Leo's armored SUV while it was parked at a municipal lot the day before. The cathedral was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, its vaulted ceilings echoing with the choir's hymns. Madeline sat in the secluded balcony, the stained glass light washing over her. For the first time in a year, she closed her eyes and felt a genuine sense of peace. Downstairs, the peace shattered. It started with a muffled pop, indistinguishable from a backfiring car to the untrained ear. But Leo's head snapped up. His earpiece crackled with frantic static from the perimeter guards. "Albanians!" the voice in Leo's ear barked. "They brought heavy artillery. We're pinned at the south entrance." Leo drew his suppressed Sig Sauer, grabbing Madeline's arm with bruising force. "We move, now." "What's happening? Where is Lily?" Madeline gasped, panic instantly seizing her throat. "Maria has her in the secure room," Leo grunted, shoving her toward the narrow spiral staircase at the back of the balcony. "We're going to the underground crypts to wait for the boss's extraction team." They burst out of the stairwell into the dimly lit, stone-lined corridor beneath the church. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and old incense. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door at the far end of the corridor was kicked open. 2 of Dushku's men stepped through, raising automatic weapons. Leo didn't hesitate. He pushed Madeline behind a thick marble pillar and returned fire, his shots precise and lethal. The deafening roar of gunfire filled the crypt, stone chips flying into the air as bullets chewed through the ancient masonry. One of the Albanians dropped, but a bullet grazed Leo's shoulder, spinning him violently against the wall. "Run!" Leo roared at Madeline, clutching his bleeding arm. "Go through the maintenance tunnels." Madeline didn't want to leave him, but the terror overriding her system propelled her forward. She sprinted down the branching corridor, her boots echoing on the stone, the heavy green coat billowing behind her. She pushed through a metal fire door, bursting out into a snow-covered alleyway behind the cathedral. She slammed into a solid chest. Strong hands gripped her arms, digging painfully into her biceps. Madeline screamed, thrashing wildly. "Stop it! Stop fighting me, Maddie!" The voice froze the blood in her veins. She looked up. Richard Gallagher stared down at her. He looked unhinged, his designer coat dusted with snow, his eyes wide and bloodshot. Behind him stood Agim Dushku, a smoking pistol in his hand. "Did you really think you could just walk away from me?" Richard sneered, his grip tightening until Madeline whimpered. "Did you think some greaseball mobster could keep what's mine?" "Let me go, Richard," Madeline pleaded, her voice trembling, though a new, unfamiliar spark of defiance ignited in her chest. "You don't own me." Richard raised a hand to strike her, his face contorted in rage. Before his hand could fall, The deafening screech of tires tore through the alley. A black, heavily armored Escalade smashed through the wrought-iron security gates, pinning one of Ogim's men against the brick wall with a sickening crunch. The doors flew open. Vincent Castellano stepped out into the blizzard. Vincent was not wearing a tailored suit. He wore a heavy tactical jacket, and in his hands was a matte black assault rifle. The cold, calculating CEO was gone. This was the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld, and his wrath was absolute. Agim Dushku raised his pistol, but Vincent moved with terrifying speed. 2 controlled bursts echoed in the narrow alley. Dushku's knee shattered, dropping the syndicate leader to the snow with a guttural scream, followed instantly by a second shot that disarmed him. Richard froze, using Madeline as a human shield, pulling her tightly against his chest. His bravado vanished, replaced by stark, shivering terror. "Drop the gun, Castellano!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking. "I'll snap her neck, I swear to God." Vincent lowered the rifle, letting it hang by its tactical sling. He pulled a custom 1911 pistol from his holster, his dark eyes locking onto Richard with a gaze that promised a slow, agonizing death. "Richard Gallagher," Vincent said, his voice eerily calm, cutting through the howling wind. "You are a very stupid man." "I have the police in my pocket. I have the alderman," Richard yelled, his grip on Madeline suffocating her. "You have nothing," Vincent replied smoothly, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "While you were busy making deals with dead men, my lawyers were busy with the FBI. Agent Bradley Hayes of the Corruption Task Force raided your downtown offices 20 minutes ago. We handed them a beautifully documented portfolio of your bribes, your extortion, and your fraudulent zoning permits. The banks have frozen your assets. You are bankrupt, Richard, and your pet detective, Kowalski, is currently sitting in a federal holding cell, singing like a bird." Richard's face went entirely slack. The empire he had built on cruelty and arrogance had been dismantled while he was standing in an alley. "You're lying," Richard whispered, his hands trembling. "I don't need to lie to dead men," Vincent said. "Let her go." "She's my wife." "She was your victim," Vincent corrected, his voice dropping an octave. "And now, she is under my protection." In that moment of Richard's panicked realization, his grip loosened just a fraction. It was all Madeline needed. Channeling the survival instinct that had kept her alive in -12-degree weather, she stomped her heavy winter boot down onto Richard's instep with all her might, simultaneously throwing her elbow backward into his ribs. Richard gasped, his hold breaking. Madeline scrambled forward, throwing herself toward Vincent. Vincent caught her with his left arm, pulling her tightly behind his broad back, positioning his own body between her and the threat. Richard stumbled, reaching inside his coat for a concealed weapon. Vincent raised the 1911. He didn't hesitate. He didn't blink. The gunshot rang out, singular and definitive. Richard fell backward into the snow, a blossoming stain of crimson spreading across his chest. He gasped once, looking up at the grey Chicago sky, and then lay perfectly still. Agim Dushku, bleeding out on the pavement, groaned. Vincent didn't even look at him. He keyed his radio. "Clean up the alley. Dushku is alive. Take him to the warehouse. He and I are going to have a long conversation about my daughter." Vincent turned his attention entirely to Madeline. He holstered his weapon and cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs frantically checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you?" Madeline looked up at the fearsome mob boss. She saw the violence he was capable of, the absolute destruction he could rain down on a city. Yet all she felt was an overwhelming, profound sense of safety. "I'm okay," she whispered, her hands gripping the lapels of his tactical jacket. "I'm okay, Vincent." He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her hair. "I told you," he murmured against her ear. "The ghosts of your past do not cross my threshold." 3 months later, the Chicago winter finally broke, giving way to a crisp, bright spring. The Albanian syndicate was a memory, completely dismantled by the Castellano family. Richard Gallagher's death was officially ruled an underworld casualty, his reputation destroyed in the press by the FBI indictments. Madeleine Foster was completely, legally and physically free. She stood on the sweeping stone terrace of the Oak Brook estate, watching Lily run across the manicured lawns, chasing a golden retriever puppy Vincent had bought her. Vincent stepped out onto the terrace, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Madeleine, standing close enough that their shoulders brushed. He was no longer just her protector. Over the last few months, the trauma that brought them together had forged a deep, unbreakable partnership. "Dr. Harrison says your lung capacity is back to 100%, Vincent noted, taking a sip of his coffee. "I feel good," Madeleine smiled, looking at him. "Actually, I feel perfect." She was wearing a light spring dress, but draped over the wrought-iron chair beside her was the heavy, emerald-green wool coat. Vincent noticed her looking at it. "You don't need that anymore. It's 60 degrees out." Madeleine reached out, running a hand over the repaired fabric and the replaced wooden button. It had once been a symbol of her poverty, her desperation, and her near death in the freezing alley. But now, it meant something entirely different. It was the armor she had shed to save a child. It was the beacon that had brought Vincent to her door. "I know I don't need it," Madeleine said softly, leaning her head against Vincent's arm as he wrapped it securely around her waist. "But I think I'll keep it anyway. Just as a reminder." Vincent kissed the top of her head, his dark eyes watching his daughter laugh in the sun. "A reminder of what?" "That sometimes," Madeleine smiled, "stepping out into the freezing cold is exactly how you find your way to the fire." The narrative arc of "she gave her only coat to the Mafia boss's freezing daughter" explores themes of profound sacrifice and the stark contrast between systemic abuse and fierce, protective loyalty. By placing Madeleine in a situation where she surrenders her only means of survival, the emerald green coat, the story underscores her innate humanity against the backdrop of a brutal environment. Vincent Castellano, while operating outside the law, provides a moral counterpoint to Richard Gallagher's legitimate but corrupt existence. The twists, including Richard's fatal alliance with the Albanian syndicate, serve to merge Madeleine's past trauma with her present sanctuary, forcing a definitive, dramatic resolution. Grounding these dramatic beats in realistic settings, like Holy Name Cathedral and the grueling Chicago winter, anchors the high stakes.